Hello and welcome to the Clayton Bridges Book Club. I'm excited to have you here. This is the first time I've done this. This is the second book review I've done. I haven't been reading forever. I really just got into reading the past couple years just because it struck me that so many successful people talk about how important reading is, and I really missed it, you know? I'm going to be doing a series called CBBC, Clayton Bridges Book Club, where I just come on and I talk about the books I've read and discuss them. First on the list, Trevor Noah's Born a Crime. You more than likely know him as the host of The Daily Show. So at this point, he is a writer, comedian, Daily Show host, television personality, basically. Now, knowing he is a comedian, I knew this was going to be a funny book, but I will say the first pro would be that it was a very, very funny book. Trevor Noah's sense of humor really came through in this book in practically, well, definitely every page, I should say, and it seemed like no matter what the situation he was talking about, he could at least find some sense of humor. Real quick, a summary of this book. It's called Born a Crime: Stories from a South African Childhood. It's more or less memoirs from when he was a kid growing up in South Africa, growing up in a time when apartheid was crumbling, so to speak. However, there was still a lot of remnants of, racial issues in South Africa. It focuses around his mother. The book really revolves around his mother and the ways that his mother would take care of him, chose to raise him. And his mother was a really interesting person. She was a very strong woman, very independent, and she did quite a lot for the survival of her kids. So what makes this story so interesting really is the fact that it is in apartheid, or at least apartheid ending. What's really interesting is how the country divides people. South Africa apparently divided people into whites, blacks, and then coloreds. Coloreds being what Americans would refer to as mixed, basically. I would be generally mixed white and black. So if you were colored, you were basically not welcome in either community, which I found very interesting. That's very different than the culture that we live in, well, and particularly today in general. This pretty much, as the front of the book says, is a collection of stories from his childhood. Some are rather tragic, some are purely comical. A lot of them shed a lot of light on a lot of issues that I think are very relevant today still, particularly at this point in America in 2020. 2020 has been a somewhat chaotic year with a lot of racial tension. I think this book is a very helpful resource for people to perhaps understand what is happening a little better. There's a lot of funny references. There's a whole lot that's genuinely interesting. So, Trevor himself being a colored kid, or labeled a colored in this culture, provided a lot of issues for him. He was also a very smart kid, so he picked up all of the languages of all the tribes of South Africa, which ended up helping him tremendously. His mother was pretty adamant on him learning that kind of thing, I think mainly for survival and independence, but it ended up helping him a lot, which was very interesting. He tells a couple stories about, for example, dating people and some other stuff, and there's some very, very funny instances. For example, chapter 15 is labeled Go Hitler. It's rather funny because the theme of that chapter essentially is how wacky culture really is in some ways. Basically, they had a friend whose name was Hitler, and the explanation for that was essentially in South Africa, the blacks would name themselves after some European names, and they sort of all sounded the same, or they all ran together, rather. And so Hitler was seen as more of a just common European name. And so there's some development. Essentially at that point in the book, he talks about his career as a DJ. He begins pirating CDs, and eventually he puts together a big mixtape, begins DJing, and they went to an event. Hitler was there, and they brought Hitler to a Jewish celebration, basically. So, I mean, even just saying that sounds funny, but there's all kinds of wacky things like that, other situations that he gets himself into. It is the story of a young man who is trying to thrive in poverty and racism. It's just inspirational in the fact that when you look what he had to go through, and of course now being a very popular television host, probably doing very well for himself. It's a big contrast to what he grew up in. Literally, sleeping on the floor, eating what they had to, etc. It's a pretty humbling story when you learn about it. But his attitude about the whole thing is very nice. He's not preachy by any means. More of him just being a smart and humorous individual, sort of laughing at how ridiculous this situation that he's in is, or at least as far as the racism, kind of making light of the Hitler thing, to which he even replied, to him or to South Africans, Hitler was not the worst person in the world. So that's just an interesting cultural difference, whereas in the Western world we may look at him as the worst. So some of the definite pros of this book would be, I would say, the lessons it teaches and the insight into South Africa and what it was like as a culture at this time. Now keep in mind this was when apartheid was ending. Well, and after it ended. So he does go to talk about some of the residual effects. And I think that's a big discussion in America as well, where we are starting to look at a lot of the institutionalized and generational, basically racism, really just the lingering of these types of things. And in South Africa, it is still very segregated. And it also gives some insight into why that is. Language, he describes in this, is a massive, massive barrier for a lot of people. The way people talk and the language they use brings people together, which is why him, knowing the language he does, he is able to manage his way around the world so well. In fact, one of these chapters is called Chameleon for that very reason. He's able to blend into these other cultures simply by language, whether he's colored or not. The story of his mother is very interesting. Again, she was a very headstrong woman, very independent, and did a lot of pretty crazy stuff for her survival, and even having Trevor. She had Trevor with a white man from Switzerland who was not exactly in the picture anymore. Not necessarily in a foul way, but simply, I think, because if he was still in the picture and a black and white couple existed in this world, they could have been killed, harassed, who knows, or perhaps the child would be taken away, but basically they couldn't be seen together as a family. And it offers a lot of other interesting insights, a lot of, it's kind of funny and refreshing to see that, like, childhood in other cultures or in other situations, like, particularly economic situations, it's interesting to see as far as, like, these guys, they still had a dog, they still went out and played and went to, cause trouble. All things aside, it sounds like he had a pretty fulfilling childhood. Not to mention, based on these stories, he was quite a troublemaker and a curious kid. So, some of the cons of this book, I suppose, well, kind of two things, and they're really not a big deal. It's overall a great book. If I could give it any criticism, one would be the chronology is a little odd. The way it's laid out in the book, slightly confusing. And the other thing is, and again, I don't know if this is a fair criticism or a criticism at all, when I picked this book up and I looked at it, I actually thought it was going to be less humorous than it was. I thought it was going to be a much more serious dig into racism and a story about his mother, and it was, but the way he approached it, I think, was just a lot different than I thought it was going to be. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. It's barely a con. His attitude towards the whole thing took a very humorous approach to it, and there was still pain that bled through. I don't know, for some reason I expected it to sort of break down and talk more deeply about the segregation and racism that was going on, and it did, and it made some really interesting points, especially the differences in culture of South Africa and, like, America. It was more of a story form talking about his mother as well as his antics during his childhood, which, again, super entertaining, super fun. a lot of lessons. But he also brought to light some of the differences between South Africa and America, which I think are really interesting and really important. But the main difference that I would point out that he brings up is really the level of bullshit that America layers on top of our racism. In America, they'll pretend to be giving you a ticket, or they'll pretend like something is wrong with your car to pull you over and then beat you. Where in South Africa, they'll pull you over and tell you they're beating you because you're black. But I learned a lot about South Africa as well, and overall, it's just a really interesting story. His mother was a very interesting person who made this choice to get with this Swiss guy, have a child, and take care of him, just because she felt that's what she needs to do. She was very religious, and she did all these things to take care of her kids, all these crazy situations she got in and out of, and she was a pretty badass woman. And there's a little bit of a twist at the end. You might even call it two twists. I'm not going to spoil that, of course. But anyway, I'll read this. I got pulled over in Hillbrow. Cops in South Africa don't give you a reason when they pull you over. Cops pull you over because they're cops and they have the power to pull you over. It's as simple as that. I used to watch American movies where cops would pull people over and say, "You didn't signal," or "Your taillight's out." I would always wonder, why do American cops bother lying? One thing I appreciate about how South Africa is that we have not yet refined the system to the point where we feel the need to lie. Do you know why I pulled you over? Because you're a policeman and I'm a black person? That's correct. License and registration, please. Really sort of makes fun of racism by just pointing out how stupid some of it is and how little logic or sense some of the things make. I think this book's awesome. I'm gonna give it a 4 out of 5. I guess it's not a perfect book, but it's really not bad. I think if I rate something a 4 or 5, it's an absolute suggestion to read. I think this is 100% worth buying. I think right now, especially, it's super, super relevant with how divided everything in this country feels. I think this provides a lot of insight into the similarities and dissimilarities between America and South Africa in light of that issue. If you would like to give this book a shot and go ahead and read it for yourself, then there is a link in the description below. Go ahead and cop you a copy, and I do receive a little bit of commission on that Amazon Associates link, but this is a genuine recommendation for this book. And it doesn't feel like it gets too dark, even though it's on a heavy subject. He brings a lot of levity to it. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the first episode of Clayton Bridges Book Club, let me know if you want to see more. That's awesome. I'm currently reading a new book, so our next book that I'm going to talk about is How to Read a Book. That's right, which is so far really good. But anyway, that'll be the next book I talk about, and stay tuned for it. Leave a like if you liked it, comment if you have something to say, and subscribe if you want to see more. Thank you so much. I'll see you later.